everybody, it's Todd Prescott with the Sasquatch Archives. Today is day 19 of SQUATCHMAS. I will be showcasing an interview, or part of an interview I did with John Green back in August of 2012, so nearly a decade ago. The interview has never before been made public. I have to be honest, when I interviewed John Green, I wasn't the best interviewer. I did have a fair amount of experience interviewing mixed martial arts fighters, some rather well known, so it wasn't as if I was intimidated by any stretch of the imagination. It's just at that stage of John Green's life, he admittedly was not great at providing narratives. So my questions didn't always elicit great responses, and I know that he'd been asked the questions that I was asking a million times. So I actually tried to approach it somewhat in a different way when I realized what I was doing wasn't working. Some of the audio, at least the portion with me asking questions, I was too close to the camera, so it was distorted. Consequently, the questions will be in text form rather than the listener having to listen to distorted audio. I hope you enjoy the first part of the interview.
No, of course I don't remember. I mean, the stories would come up every few months or years all the time I was growing up. The person that was writing those things in those days, but I didn't know anything about that. Well, I was familiar with the stories. I know who he was. It was just a curiosity. Oh yes, of course. The first thing was when, I already knew that the Sasquatch stories attached to the Harrison River area. And by this time I owned the newspaper in that area, but I didn't take it at all seriously. But then Rennie DeHinden had been told about the Sasquatch by a farmer who was working for in Alberta. He came out here to go look for them, and so of course I wrote this peculiar person up in my newspaper. But that started local talk, and a printer that worked for me, and then also myself independently, one weekend we found ourselves talking to people here who did take it very seriously, and people that we already knew. So that was quite a jolt. And that's when I got it looking into those reports, and they stood up very, very well. For instance, there'd been a sighting just a few miles from here where a deputy sheriff had come up here from Bellingham, he was already investigating this sort of thing, made casts and taken measurements and so on. He was dead, but you know, his family members were still ill. And the custodian at the high school was one of the people who'd investigated at the time. I knew him very well. He was telling me what the footprints were like. So yeah, that's when I really got interested, and when a lot of publicity started, and the publicity stimulated more stories. And I missed a step. When there was a lot of talk around here, it was right at the time when British Columbia was going to celebrate its centennial in 1958. This was 1957. And every community was offered a matching grant to do a permanent something, whatever, to commemorate the centenary. And Harrison Hot Springs had about 600 people. The grant would have been something like less than $600. One of the council members, as a result of the publicity that was going on, he wondered if they could make a statue of the Sasquatch. Well, of course, the money was totally inadequate for that. And then somebody else wondered if they could spend it looking for the Sasquatch. So they voted to ask permission to do that. And that just blew the whole world wide open. I mean, here was a government, mind a tiny one, wanting to look for a monster. We got clippings back from Asia and, you know, all over the place. And so that's when the newspaper stories in the daily papers started, and then they were getting stories. There was a period when both the big daily newspapers in Vancouver listed Sasquatch on their front page index. You know, I doubt there's ever been a more successful publicity stunt that cost nothing. But anyway, so these stories came up, and Rennie and I would look into the more interesting ones, and you know, some of them were very interesting indeed. I mean, some of the best stories there are to this day came out right at the beginning, like William Rose, for instance.
Go ahead.
Time to refresh. Yeah, and I diverted him to some of the local hunters to, you know, talk him out of it. No, I just thought that he was an immigrant from Switzerland who didn't really understand very much about. Oh, he was quite easy to converse with. Had an accent, of course. I saw a picture in the paper, actually, of Jerry Crew holding a Bigfoot cast. My wife and I went down there just to see what it was all about, which of course we would never have done. I'd already been immersed in it. And we did see some old tracks, but they're not particularly good. But the most significant thing we did was to drive over to Reading in order to see Bob Titmus, who was as a taxidermist, was the closest thing to a scientist who was reported to have seen the tracks. And so we spent an afternoon with him. And then about 3 weeks later, he wrote me a letter saying that he and another man had found some different tracks. So then another fellow and I went down there again and went and saw those tracks. And those tracks were in hard sand, on a damp, solid sand, and they sank in about an inch. And they were, you know, an area at least double that of a human boot. And I was walking around them and I wasn't sinking in at all. And of course we had a conversation about how you could fake these, and you know, and we couldn't think of anything because this creek bed was at the bottom of slopes that were quite steep and covered with brush and so on. You couldn't have brought a machine down there without it being obvious. And the only possibility was a helicopter, but there was a construction camp up a hill on the road not very far away that had people in it all the time. So if there'd ever been a helicopter in there, it would be known. The sandbars at one end went into a log jam, or real mess of logs. You couldn't have brought anything over that. A little ways upstream, it went through a small canyon with sheer sides. And, we even talked about what you might do with explosives, or, how could you possibly fake these imprints? Well, I mean, here it is a half a century later, and no reasonable idea of how you could fake those prints has ever surfaced. Nobody has ever even made a serious try. So that's when it really hit me. There is something. There has to be something. And I've been trying ever since 1958 to establish what it is that makes those tracks. And of course the tracks have continued to be made throughout all that time, and all over North America. I don't remember the precise sensation, but it certainly had an impact. I got up on a log in the log jam. It was a foot and a half or so off the ground, and jumped down on one heel, the point of one heel, and it didn't get any deeper than the whole area of those tracks. What on earth, But there they were. Something had made them. How were they made? Not them. There were three of us there, and it was daylight. Certainly was good and nervous some other occasions. That was a real break that she went with me. So many people, their wives just, they're out of their minds. Yeah. Well, she never objected to what I was doing at any point, and she always took it seriously. Well, probably, but I'll give an example. These tracks at Ruby Creek, we found 4 people who were available who had seen them. And they all agreed that it appeared that the thing had just stepped over the railroad fence, which was about 4.5 feet high. And the husbands were both tremendously impressed, and the wives really didn't mean much to them. They just didn't have the same degree of interest. Now, I'm not arguing that that's, there's lots of women that get very interested, but my wife didn't. Well, one time she thought she'd found some footprints. She was pretty excited, actually, just in Harrison. Yeah, well, she came with me quite often when we went somewhere, sure. Obviously, they thought I was a very peculiar thing I'd gotten mixed up in, but well, there's something of note. When I first published a book, I was therefore making some money out of it. The general attitude locally changed completely. It wasn't nuts anymore. I was, well, it's not a credibility as far as the things being real, but it changed my reputation. I was doing this to make money. That made sense. I have no idea what had been said behind my back in those and later years. People in general don't think it could be so, still to this day.
Thanks a lot for listening, and stay tuned for the next part. Again, there may be 2 more parts. We'll see.
Please support this channel by subscribing and leaving comments. Stay well, stay safe. Here's wishing each and every one of you a wonderful holiday season. Merry Squatchmas, everyone!